They made me sign a non-compete for $13 per hour, laughing, "You're not worth worrying about anyway." Then they overworked me, skipped breaks, and deducted pay for fake training fees. I documented every violation and sent it to the Dole CCNG, their biggest rival. When the fines hit hard, they begged me to stay, but I had already switched sides. When my manager, Rick, said those words to me, the room went quiet except for the whirring of the busted AC unit in the corner. It was a Tuesday morning at Apex Solutions in Fort Worth, Texas, and I was sitting across from him with a half-crumpled offer letter for a $13 an hour customer service job. The letter had a thick packet stapled to it, pages of legal jargon that made my stomach twist. The clause that caught my eye said I couldn't work for any competitor in the same industry within a 100-mile radius for 2 years after leaving Apex. I laughed a little when I read it aloud. This can't apply to me. I'm just answering phones. Rick smirked, leaned back in his chair and said, "Don't worry about it. You'll never be worth enough to worry about it anyway." The way he said it, like I was already disposable, burned a hole in my chest. I was 24, just trying to pay rent, and that line stuck to me like grease. I signed the papers anyway, mostly because I needed the job that bad. The next few weeks, I learned exactly what kind of place I just walked into. We weren't allowed to sit unless on calls. Lunch breaks were unpaid and sometimes forgotten. Rick liked to hover behind people's desks, nitpicking their tone or accusing them of not smiling enough when talking to customers. And then there was payroll, always delayed or adjusted for training deductions. The company was small enough to hide its dirt but big enough to bully. Most of us were scared to complain because the owner, Carol, loved to remind everyone, "We have lawyers who eat whistleblowers for breakfast." So I played the part. I smiled. I apologized when yelled at. I nodded when Carol called us ungrateful brats. But quietly, I started keeping records. Every schedule, every paycheck stub, every policy memo that violated labor laws. I copied emails where Carol threatened people for asking about overtime. I took photos of the schedule board showing 10-hour shifts with no breaks. I didn't know what I'd do with it all yet. I just knew something in me had cracked open that first day when Rick said I wasn't worth worrying about. The turning point came when my coworker, Jen, got fired for asking about her missing overtime pay. Carol told everyone she was toxic and banned us from talking to her. The next day, I checked my own hours and found over 20 unpaid hours labeled as training fees. I confronted Rick, and he shrugged, saying, "Company policy. If you don't like it, you can leave." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment staring at my growing pile of documents, listening to the hum of my fridge, thinking about how powerless they thought I was. The next morning, I came to work, smiled like nothing was wrong, and said, "Sure thing, Rick," when he dumped another task on me. What he didn't know was that I'd already started writing the first email to the Department of Labor, and that I had someone in the CC line who would change everything for Apex Solutions. But the part that still makes me grin? The day I hit send, Carol called an emergency meeting to announce massive growth and brag about how unbeatable Apex was in the market. She didn't know she was already on the clock. When the investigation started and the fines rolled in, they begged me to. I didn't end up at Apex Solutions because I wanted to. I ended up there because I was desperate. 6 months before that meeting with Rick, I'd been working at a local warehouse for a logistics company called Transpro in Arlington. It wasn't glamorous, just lifting, scanning, shipping, but it was honest work. Then one afternoon, the manager called me into his office and said the company was downsizing. They gave me 2 weeks severance and a good luck handshake. That was it. At the time, I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment off I-30, barely making rent. My mom had passed away a year earlier, and I didn't have any safety net, no family nearby, no savings. My best friend, Kyle, offered to let me crash on his couch, but I couldn't handle the thought of being that person. I spent the next few months applying to everything: retail, call centers, restaurants, temp agencies. I must have sent out 50 applications before Apex finally called. Their ad said, "Hiring immediately, friendly team environment, growth opportunities, no experience necessary." They made it sound like a family. They even promised bonuses for top performers. I remember walking into the interview thinking maybe my luck was finally turning around. The office was clean, bright, full of motivational posters that said things like, "Be the change you want to see," and "Teamwork makes the dream work." But now I realize that's how they baited people like me. People who needed a break so bad we'd ignore the red flags. From day one, everything about Apex felt off. Carol, the owner, was the kind of person who called herself a visionary. She'd built the company from her garage, supposedly, and liked to tell the story of how no one ever handed her anything. She made us recite company mottos in meetings and post our weekly gratitude lists on the bulletin board. If you didn't participate, you were labeled negative. And Rick, well, he was her enforcer. He'd been there since the beginning, and everyone knew he was untouchable. He flirted with the women, mocked the men, and bragged about how Carol trusted him with everything. Once, I overheard him laughing in the break room about firing someone for asking for a raise. "She thought she was special," he said, smirking. "Guess she found out otherwise." The worst part was how subtle their control was. They didn't just underpay us. They humiliated us into silence. We had to ask permission to take bathroom breaks. We were told to clock out if we were between tasks. And the non-compete? It was their favorite threat. Rick once cornered a coworker named Marcus, who'd put in his 2-week notice to go work for a competitor. Rick waved the contract in his face and said, "You want to get sued for 30 grand over a call center job? Be my guest." Marcus withdrew his resignation the next day. I remember thinking that can't be legal. But then again, what could any of us do? We were the kind of people who needed every paycheck. People they knew would swallow their pride and show up again on Monday. So I smiled through it just like everyone else. I smiled when Carol bragged about her leadership style. I smiled when Rick said things like, "People like you should be grateful we give you a shot." But behind that smile, I was building something they couldn't see. I'd started a folder on my Google Drive labeled Taxes. Inside were copies of everything I could find: emails, policy updates, pay records, screenshots of our group chats. I didn't even know exactly what I'd do with it yet, but something deep down told me I'd need it someday. I didn't realize how soon that someday would come. Because a month later, Carol rolled out a new policy called Performance Accountability Deductions. It meant if a customer gave you a low rating, they'd dock your paycheck. No warnings, no appeal. That's when things started to unravel. And that's when I realized Apex wasn't just unethical. They were breaking the law wide open. The first paycheck under the new Performance Accountability Deductions system hit like a punch to the gut. I'd worked 112 hours over 2 weeks. Long shifts, barely eating, barely sitting, and my paycheck came out to $837. It should have been at least $1,450. I thought it was a mistake, so I went to Rick's office and knocked. He didn't look up from his computer when he said, "Come in." I told him about the missing money, showed him my hours, and waited for him to say it was some kind of clerical error. Instead, he said, "Yeah, we took out your penalties." Penalties? He swiveled in his chair, finally looking at me with that smug grin I'd grown to hate. "You got 2 negative surveys this week. One customer said you sounded short on the phone. The other said you put them on hold too long. You know the policy." I stared at him. "That's $600 gone." He shrugged. "Maybe try smiling more. Remember, you represent the company." That was the moment something inside me hardened. I nodded, said, "Got it," and walked out. But that night, I stayed up until 2 a.m., combing through the Fair Labor Standards Act. I discovered everything they were doing. Non-competes for low-wage workers, unpaid overtime, unlawful deductions was completely illegal. Every word of it. So I started documenting everything. I used my phone to record meetings where Carol said things like, "We don't owe overtime if we call it development time." I took photos of the posted schedule showing 60-hour weeks. I started quietly asking coworkers to forward me their pay stubs, promising to keep them anonymous. At first, people were scared. But once Jen got fired for asking about her pay, everyone started whispering. Then came the day I found the spreadsheet. Rick left his office unlocked when he went to lunch. I was supposed to print training materials for him, so I sat at his computer, clicked documents, and there it was, employeetracking.xlsx. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. And what I saw made my stomach twist. It listed every employee, their pay rate, deductions, and a column labeled behavioral notes. Next to my name it said, smart but entitled. Watch her. Possible risk for compliance issues. But that wasn't the worst part. Under deductions, there were coded entries that didn't match anything on our pay stubs. Training recovery, attitude adjustment, time lag reclaim. They were stealing from everyone systematically. When I printed a few pages to keep as evidence, the office printer jammed. I panicked, yanked the paper out, and shoved it in my bag just as Rick came back. He didn't notice. That night, I started writing my report. I listed every violation in chronological order. Unpaid overtime, forced non-competes, illegal deductions, retaliatory firings. I attached every photo, every email, every screenshot. It was 54 pages long by the time I was done. And then I realized something else, a way to hit them harder. I remembered how Carol always bragged that Apex's biggest competitor, Silverline Support, had tried to poach our clients but failed. I did some digging. Turns out Silverline had an HR compliance division, and they just posted an opening for an analyst position. The listing said, seeking individuals with direct experience in call center compliance and documentation. I sat there at 3 a.m. staring at that posting, thinking about the irony. I could expose Apex and walk straight into a better job. But before I could even apply, I needed to make sure Apex went down properly, quietly, legally. So I sent 2 emails. One to the U.S. Department of Labor, detailing every violation. The other, identical in content, to Silverline Support's HR department, with the subject line, documentation regarding Apex Solutions labor practices. I CC'd both to myself for proof. Then I hit send. What I didn't know was that one of those emails wouldn't just ruin Apex. It would expose something I hadn't even seen coming. Something that made everything I'd suffered look like a warm-up. Because when the investigation began, I learned the real reason Carol kept that non-compete so tight. And it had nothing to do with protecting her business. 2 weeks after I sent the emails, everything exploded. It started with an unannounced visit. A pair of investigators from the U.S. Department of Labor walked into the office mid-morning while Carol was in the middle of one of her motivational speeches about company loyalty. The whole place froze. They flashed badges, introduced themselves calmly, and asked to speak to the owner privately. Carol tried to laugh it off, but her face went pale. Rick stood by her side, pretending to be confused, asking, "What's this about?" They walked into her office, closed the door, and stayed in there for nearly 2 hours. Everyone pretended to keep working, but the silence was thick. You could practically hear the panic spreading. When the investigators finally left, Carol emerged red-faced, clutching a manila folder. She didn't say a word to anyone. She just stormed out, slamming the door so hard a photo fell off the wall. By the end of the day, rumors were flying. Something about wage theft, federal violations, potential lawsuits. I kept my head down, pretending to be just as confused as everyone else. Inside, I was shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline. The next morning, Carol called an all-hands emergency meeting. Her tone was brittle, fake calm. She stood in front of us, trying to project authority, but her voice cracked halfway through. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said. "Someone has made false allegations against this company. We are cooperating fully with the Department of Labor, and we will find out who's responsible for this attack." That word, attack, hung in the air like a blade. Rick stood behind her, scanning the room, eyes sharp. He stopped on me for a second too long. That's when I knew. They suspected me. And I was right, because 3 days later my access badge stopped working. I showed up for my shift and couldn't get in. Rick met me at the door with 2 security guards. He handed me an envelope and said, "We're parting ways." His tone was ice. Inside the envelope was a termination letter that said I was being let go for insubordination and failure to maintain a positive team attitude. They also included a reminder about my non-compete clause, stating that I was legally barred from working in any similar role in any competing business for 2 years. It was such a predictable move that I almost laughed. But what stopped me cold was the second page of the letter. It listed attachments for company property retrieval, and there was a reference number I didn't recognize, A1109. That number stuck in my head. Later that night, I realized I'd seen it before. On one of the documents I'd pulled from Rick's computer, the employee spreadsheet. The last column had a header, A file. My file number was A1109. I thought it was just an internal tag, but now I needed to know what was really in it. So I called Jen, the coworker they'd fired weeks earlier for asking about her missing pay. She'd been staying with her sister and had nothing to lose anymore. When I told her what happened, she laughed bitterly. "You don't know, do you?" she said. "Know what? Apex isn't just stealing pay. They're selling data." She explained that when she worked there, she'd accidentally seen an email thread between Carol and an affiliate partner. The company wasn't just running customer support. It was collecting personal info from clients and reselling it. Full names, addresses, even billing details from some of their smaller clients who used Apex for outsourced customer handling. The non-compete wasn't to protect their customer base. It was to keep employees quiet. Carol knew if anyone left and went to a real company, the truth would leak out. The contract was their muzzle. And Rick? He was the one moving the data. The deductions, the fake penalties, the training fees. They were side hustles to keep the cash flowing while they funneled sensitive info to third parties. I sat there, holding the phone, realizing I hadn't just exposed wage theft. I'd kicked open the door to something criminal. That's when the phone buzzed again. A new email. It was from Silverline Support, the company I'd CC'd. The subject line read, "Regarding your documentation on Apex Solutions, confidential follow-up." The first line of the email nearly stopped my heart. "We believe you may have uncovered an ongoing data fraud operation. Our compliance team and legal counsel would like to speak with you immediately." That's when I realized I wasn't just a whistleblower anymore. I was a witness. The day after I got fired, I woke up to 6 missed calls, 2 from unknown numbers, 1 from a blocked caller, and 3 from Apex's main office line. No voicemails, just silence. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened my laptop and reread the email from Silverline Support's compliance team. They wanted to set up a confidential call to discuss the nature of Apex Solutions' operational practices and possible whistleblower protection. I agreed immediately. That afternoon, I found myself on a video call with 2 people. Tara, Silverline's HR director, and Evan, their in-house attorney. I'd expected corporate politeness, but what I got was urgency. They already knew about the DOL investigation. Apparently, word had spread fast. What they didn't know were the details I had. The files, the pay stubs, the spreadsheet with coded deductions, and now the whispered allegations of data sales. When I told them about the A files and the suspicious partnerships, they both looked at each other through the camera. Evan said, quietly, "If what you're describing is accurate, Apex isn't just committing labor violations. They're violating federal data protection laws." Tara leaned forward and said, "Would you be willing to share copies of your documentation?" "Every single one," I said. That night, I compiled everything, the digital folder I'd been building for months, the photos, the printed pages, the screenshots. I renamed the folder apexevidencefinal.zip and uploaded it to a private link for Silverline's legal team. But I didn't stop there. Because if there's one thing I learned working under Carol, it's that people like her never believe they're beat. They double down. So I made a second copy. And this one wasn't for the government. It was for the court of public opinion. I created a private Twitter account under a pseudonym and started drafting a post. Ever heard of a company forcing $13 per hour employees to sign non-competes, stealing their wages, and selling client data? Meet Apex Solutions in Fort Worth, Texas. Here's the proof thread. I didn't post it yet. Not then. Timing was everything. A week later, the DOL contacted me officially. They confirmed receipt of my complaint and said Apex was under formal investigation for wage theft, unlawful deductions, and retaliation. They also hinted that my evidence had opened additional inquiries. That phrase, additional inquiries, told me they'd found the data trail. But then things got ugly. Rick started calling from blocked numbers. Once, when I didn't pick up, he left a voicemail. "You think this is over? You signed the contract. You want to play with lawyers? Go ahead. But don't forget who's got your info." That line chilled me. Your info. I didn't know if he meant my personal data or if he was just bluffing. But either way, it crossed a line. So I started my counterattack. First, I reached out to a local labor attorney in Fort Worth named David Nolan, who specialized in employment retaliation. I told him everything. He agreed to take my case on contingency, saying, "People like them count on silence. You've already done the hard part. Now let's make them pay for it." Then I called Silverline again. Tara told me that their leadership team had been discussing next steps and hinted that Apex's misconduct might open a business opportunity for them, especially if Apex's clients started jumping ship. That gave me an idea. What if, I said, Apex's clients see what they're doing? She didn't tell me to do it, but she didn't tell me not to either. That night I queued up my Twitter thread. Screenshots, payroll records, redacted names of clients, every receipt I had. I scheduled it to post at 8 a.m. the next morning, right when Carol's team would be starting their daily inspiration meeting. At 7:59 a.m., I hovered over the cancel button, second-guessing myself. This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was war. Then my phone buzzed. An email from Rick. The subject line said, "You don't know who you're messing with." I opened it. Attached was a single PDF, my signed non-compete. At the bottom, written in bold red font, was a sentence that hadn't been there before. "Violation of this agreement will result in full disclosure of personal data obtained during employment." I froze. That wasn't part of the contract I'd signed. They had forged a new version. That's when I realized they weren't just scared. They were cornered. And desperate people do dangerous things. I clicked post. Within 2 hours, the thread had over 10,000 retweets. And within 24, it reached someone I hadn't expected. Someone who knew exactly what Carol and Rick were hiding, because they'd helped them do it. By noon the next day, my Twitter thread had gone nuclear. Screenshots of Apex's payroll scams were being shared by labor rights accounts, tech journalists, and even a couple of small business watchdog pages. Someone tagged the Department of Labor's official handle. Another tagged Silverline Support, who posted a statement saying, "We do not condone exploitative labor practices in our industry." Carol must have been losing her mind. I was expecting silence, or maybe a lawsuit threat. But what came instead was a message from someone I didn't recognize. A DM from an account named JT Former Apex. "I saw your thread. You need to know what really happened with the data. Call me before it's too late." I hesitated, thinking it might be a troll. But the account had old posts, pictures of the Apex office, inside jokes only employees would know. It was real. I called him. "Hey," I said, "you worked at Apex?" There was a pause. Then a tired voice replied, "Yeah, until last year. I was their IT admin." He told me that he'd quit suddenly after an incident involving Carol and Rick, but he'd been watching what happened since. He said he'd kept quiet because he'd signed an NDA. But seeing my post made him realize it was finally time. "What incident?" I asked. He sighed. The data sales weren't random. They weren't even about profit. Carol was laundering money through fake client accounts. I sat up straight. "Wait, what?" "Yeah, Apex had fake clients. Companies that didn't exist. She'd bill them for support services. And those payments were coming from offshore accounts. That's why she forced everyone to sign non-competes. It wasn't just to keep you quiet. It was to make sure no one left and accidentally stumbled on the shell companies." My pulse was pounding. And Rick handled the books. He's the one who created those fake deductions. The missing wages, that money was going to the same offshore accounts. My stomach turned. The training fees, the attitude deductions, they weren't just greed. They were money laundering vehicles. "Listen," he said, "they're not going to go down quietly. Carol's got friends. I already had my house broken into once after I quit. If you've got evidence, you need to back it up somewhere safe." I thanked him and hung up, feeling the edges of panic creeping in. I immediately backed up everything, every document, every message, to encrypted storage. I sent copies to Silverline's legal team, my lawyer, and even myself through a personal email thread labeled for DOJ if anything happens. And then something did happen. That night, around 10:45 p.m., my phone lit up with a notification. A failed login attempt on my bank account. Then another. Then my credit card app sent a fraud alert. Within minutes, my accounts were locked. Rick's threat echoed in my head. Don't forget who's got your info. It wasn't paranoia anymore. They'd done it. They had my personal data. I called my bank, froze everything, and filed a police report. Then I texted JT again, telling him they were coming after me now too. He responded instantly. Then you should see what's in your A file. I told him about the reference number A1109 and asked if he still had access. He paused for a long time before replying. I shouldn't, but I do. Give me a few hours. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the ceiling, wondering just how deep this went. At 3:12 a.m., another message came in. This one had a single PDF attachment and a note. Don't freak out. You need to see this. I opened it. The file header said, A1109, Behavioral Analysis/Retention Candidate. And there it was, a psychological profile. Mine. It wasn't just about my work performance. It had notes about my family, my mother's death, my financial situation, even quotes from conversations I'd had off the clock. They'd been monitoring us. Every chat, every email, maybe even our phones. At the bottom, there was a section labeled, Recommended Leverage, Financial Instability plus Family Loss equals Compliance via Guilt/Need for Approval. I felt sick. They hadn't just been exploiting our labor, they'd been profiling us to control us. That's when I realized the real horror. Apex wasn't just breaking laws. It was experimenting on its employees, using psychological manipulation to build a loyal workforce model. And Rick wasn't just a bully. He was the architect. The compliance notes, the deductions, the emotional abuse, it was all intentional. They didn't want happy employees. They wanted predictable ones. And now, with my data leak evidence going viral, I was the variable they couldn't control. That's when JT messaged again. You're not the first, but you can make sure you're the last. I met JT in person 3 days later at a coffee shop in downtown Fort Worth. He looked older than I expected, thin, tired, the kind of face that had seen too much and stopped expecting fairness. He slid a flash drive across the table. That's the real reason Apex exists, he said quietly. I plugged it into my laptop right there, and what opened wasn't a spreadsheet or a memo. It was a presentation. A PowerPoint deck titled Project ALLOY, Workforce Conditioning Initiative, Proprietary Research. The first slide had Apex's logo at the top. The second had a tagline that made my skin crawl. Emotional leverage equals employee retention. Slide after slide broke it down. They weren't just a call center. They were part of a private behavioral study, funded quietly by a venture firm Carol's brother ran out of Dallas. The whole company had been built as a front for testing behavioral modification strategies in low-income employment settings. Every policy, the non-compete, the illegal deductions, the constant gratitude rituals, the forced smiles, even the pay manipulation, was part of their control variable testing. They were gathering data on how far people could be pushed before breaking. I read in silence, feeling something deep and cold take root inside me. This is human experimentation, I whispered. JT nodded. Exactly. And they sold the results as proprietary retention technology. They called it psychology, but it was abuse with a spreadsheet. He explained that Carol's brother, Nathan Bellamy, ran an analytics startup called NeuroCore Ventures. They specialized in predictive workforce modeling. Apex was one of several companies they used as real-world test environments. That's why Carol didn't care if the call center itself lost money. The data was the profit. And Rick? He wasn't just Carol's right-hand man. He was a trained behavioral compliance consultant. Before Apex, he'd worked for a private defense contractor doing stress tolerance research on employees, projects that skirted the line between psychology and coercion. He's the one who designed your profile, JT said. He handpicked employees based on trauma, debt, and dependency. Then he ran stressors, overwork, humiliation, false hope, to measure compliance and loyalty. My throat went dry. So every cruel thing he said to us, every rule, every punishment, was calculated. JT finished. He wasn't venting. He was measuring your breaking point. For a long time, I couldn't speak. I just stared at the screen, scrolling through slide after slide. Charts, behavioral response graphs, individual case studies. Some names I recognized. Jen's was one of them. Next to her entry, resistant to emotional manipulation. Terminate to observe downstream effects. Terminate, like she was a lab rat, not a person. The final slide chilled me to the core. It was a proposal to expand Project Alloy nationwide under different company names. The bullet points read, focus on at-risk demographics, ages 20 to 35, low financial security. Exploit non-compete compliance psychology. Refine emotional debt models for improved obedience. And at the bottom, in small gray text, pending final data extraction from Apex Solutions. Q4. That's why Carol had panicked when the Department of Labor showed up. She wasn't afraid of fines. She was afraid of exposure. The government would have found the behavioral data and the offshore accounts tied to Neurocore. That's why they targeted me. I wasn't just an ex-employee. I was a breach in their experiment. I felt my pulse in my throat, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the files. So that's what the A files were. We were case studies. JT nodded grimly. You were file A1109. They only got through 1,200 participants before you blew it up. He leaned in, voice low. You can finish this. You can stop them from doing it anywhere else. How? I asked. He pointed to the flash drive. That presentation? That's their Achilles heel. It's proof that everything they did was intentional, orchestrated, and funded. If it gets out publicly, they're done. Carol, Rick, Nathan, all of them. I sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of it pressing down like a storm. I'd thought I was exposing wage theft, then data fraud. But now I saw the full picture. Apex was an experiment in breaking human resilience. They hadn't underestimated me because they thought I was weak. They'd chosen me because I was weak, because they thought they could control me. And that's what made the revenge that followed not just satisfying, but necessary. Because I wasn't going to destroy them quietly anymore. I was going to do it so loud that the whole industry would hear it echo. The next 48 hours felt like the longest of my life. Every instinct in me screamed to go quiet, to stay safe, to disappear. But there was no going back now. I had the flash drive, I had the documents, and for the first time, I had leverage that they couldn't take away. I spent that night cross-referencing every name, every company mentioned in the Project Alloy slides. Nathan Bellamy's firm, Neurocore Ventures, had received 2 federal grants for workplace optimization research. I traced the funding trail through public databases. It all checked out. They'd masked the experiment as employee productivity analytics. By dawn, I'd organized everything into a single digital archive. 1. Apex payroll and deduction evidence. 2. Internal emails and A files. 3. Project Alloy presentation and funding records. Then I did 3 things. First, I sent the archive to my lawyer, David Nolan, with explicit instructions to forward it to the DOL's Criminal Enforcement Division, the Texas Attorney General, and the FBI's Cybercrimes Unit if anything happened to me. Second, I uploaded a redacted copy, minus employee names, to a secure whistleblower repository used by investigative journalists. And third, I prepared one more thread. At exactly 9 a.m., I posted, "You thought Apex was about call centers. It was about control. They built a company to experiment on desperation. Here's proof." Hashtag Project Alloy screenshots followed. Slide titles. Funding records. A short video clip from a recorded meeting where Carol bragged about engineering loyalty. I didn't post everything, just enough to make journalists chase the rest. The internet did what it always does when the evidence is undeniable. By noon, hashtag Project Alloy was trending. By 5 p.m., A Dallas-Fort Worth news station ran a full segment. Reporters camped outside Apex's office. Carol's statement, "This is a malicious fabrication by a disgruntled employee," only made things worse once people saw her luxury car and the wage theft documents side by side on screen. Silverline called that evening. Tara sounded almost breathless. "They're imploding," she said. "Doel froze their accounts. Half their clients are moving over to us. You did it." But the part that broke me wasn't victory. It was the messages that poured into my DMs from other workers. People in Houston, Phoenix, Raleigh, saying they'd signed the same kind of contracts, been through the same motivation programs. Carol and Nathan hadn't just planned to expand. They already had. The DOL's official subpoena hit within a week. Rick was the first to fold. He tried to cut a deal, claiming he'd been just following orders. The investigators found proof of the forged contracts on his personal laptop, along with bank transfers from Neurocore's offshore accounts. He was arrested for fraud and data theft. Carol went down harder. When the feds raided her house, they found encrypted backups of all the A files, over 1,200 detailed psychological reports on employees like me. The news coverage was brutal. Her quote, "Some people only work if you make them desperate," ended up on every headline. Nathan Bellamy's venture fund was stripped of its grants within a month. The research angle turned into a criminal investigation. Multiple agencies got involved. The last I heard, all three of them were negotiating plea deals. And me? Silverline hired me. Officially, I'm in compliance now, helping write fair employment policies, making sure companies can't hide this kind of abuse again. Sometimes, when I review a contract, I catch a clause that looks familiar: non-compete, training fees, behavioral monitoring. I flag them immediately. Apex's old office building sits empty now. The sign's been stripped, but I drive by sometimes on my way home. I still remember the day Rick told me I'd never be worth enough to worry about. He was right about one thing. I wasn't worth worrying about. I was worth fearing. Because I learned exactly how much damage one underpaid, underestimated worker could do when they stopped being afraid. And that's the real story of Apex Solutions. They tried to measure loyalty, and all they discovered was what revenge looks like when you give it a paper trail.